Okay, Yerko, as you know, you've got 15 minutes to present. After your presentation, you'll have a seat and we'll ask you some questions.
Okay.
You can start now.
So, good morning, teachers. Today I will be presenting my research study, which I have titled Student Talking Time Influenced by the Horseshoe Seating Arrangement. To give you some context, this study was carried out at Universidad Santo Tomás, which is a private university located in Santiago. And the sample was a basic English 2 course with students from different programs. So the first part of this presentation corresponds to the justification of the study. And in order to start this process of researching, the first step was to determine a research topic. So what I could identify when observing the lessons was that there was a high amount of teacher talking time, and this had certain implications for the students. For instance, there was no time for them to practice the language, which is obviously detrimental considering the EFL nature of the university. Probably the students don't have many opportunities to practice the language outside an educational context, so they need to practice during the class their speaking skills, because as we know, that's a fundamental ability when maintaining a conversation in a real-life context. And I could also see that some students didn't seem engaged with the lesson, so that was detrimental both for them and for the teacher, because the lesson objective was hardly being achieved. So looking through the literature, I found out that these concepts of horseshoe seating arrangement and student talking time are actually addressed, but they are not treated as part of the same phenomenon. And that is why the purpose of this study is to determine if the horseshoe seating arrangement increases student talking time in the L2. So in this sense, the working hypothesis of the study is STT after a period of HSA is significantly higher than STT after a period without HSA, being STT student talking time and HSA the horseshoe seating arrangement. For this next part of the theoretical framework, between 2 and 3 definitions have been provided for each of the constructs, but I will be only providing the one that has more relevance for my study and for the presentation. So, in the case of English as a foreign language, or EFL, Brown defines it as learning English in a culture in which there are not many opportunities to practice the language. That is why in this study EFL is seen as the context in which the English lessons take place. In the case of adult education, Harmer states that adults might criticize teaching methods and might have experienced failure or criticism at school, which makes them anxious. So that is why adult education is seen in my study as the level of schooling of the participants that has implications of different kinds for the study itself. Then we have the horseshoe seating arrangement, or HSA, and according to Wengel, in this type of seating arrangement there is an elevated amount of talking from the students, which obviously must be the goal in an EFL class. The students need to practice the language because there are probably no more opportunities outside the educational context to carry out that task. So, for my study, HSA is the type of seating arrangement that will possibly increase student talking time. And finally, we have the construct of STT itself, and according to Sidiqua, this is the time that the learner spent talking rather than the teacher. So in the same way, for this study, STT is the length of time that the student spent speaking English during the English lesson. So in relation to the procedure, Creswell offered this design, this graphic representation of the pre-experimental design, and we see that it has 3 elements. The first element corresponds to the pre-test, then we have the X that represents the treatment being applied, and the final element that corresponds to the post-test. So in the same way, the procedure went as follows. During one lesson, I determined the initial level of student talking time, then the next lesson, the horseshoe seating arrangement was implemented. And finally, in the next class, STT was identified again in order to compare the 2 instances of observation. So the way of doing this was through this research material that is called the TTT-STT 10-minute interval chart, and the data analysis technique chosen was the t-test. Here we can see the chart, and what I did to collect the data was to divide the lesson into 4 intervals, and during each interval I would walk around the classroom listening to the students and recording with a stopwatch the amount of minutes that they were speaking. Then I would do the same process with the teacher, so that way I would identify teacher talking time. Then I would subtract the total of these 2 elements with the total of minutes of the lesson, and I would get the value, the amount of minutes for the class silent category. So So regarding the trustworthiness of the instrument and the study itself, I could say that internal validity has been ensured as the instrument was published by ACO Aotearoa, which is a government-funded organization that deals with carrying out research in the educational field. So there's a high possibility that the instrument measures what it should measure. In the case of external validity, the results of this study might only be applied to a context that is similar to the one of this study. That is to say, an EFL classroom from a private university with a basic English 2 course. In the case of objectivity, the time was measured with a stopwatch in order to be as specific as possible. And in the case of external consistency, the test and retest process was carried out, but the Pearson correlation value was not found really high. And during the next part of the presentation, I will be explaining why I think that happened. So here we have the findings, and we have two graphs. In the first graph, we can see the pre-test, and there is a total of 16 minutes of student talking time. Then on the post-test, we have a total of 19 minutes. So we can see that there is a little increase on this value. Here we have the inferential statistics chart, and the first thing that we can see is that the mean went up from 4 to 4.75. So again, we can see that there is a little increase. But the Pearson correlation value is really low. It's only from 0.1. So why I think this happened is because the variable that is being measured is not part of the students themselves, but it is an external variable. What do I mean by that? We, as people, are consistent with what we think and what we say. But since time is an external variable, then that is why it may not have been as consistent as it should have been. And in the case of the t-statistic, which is of 0.6, is also is not higher than the critical value. So we can see that there is not a significant increase on student talking time. So in conclusion, the horseshoe sitting arrangement increases student talking time, but not in a significant manner. It is important to state that I think that the horseshoe sitting arrangement should have increased SCT in a significant manner, and that is why I need to refer to the limitations of the study, so in order to understand why that didn't happen. So in the first place, it would have been ideal to have an assistant in a way so that we could compare the results and double check the information gathered in the chart. And also, this was a pre-experimental group, and the ideal scenario includes working with experimental group. So these are the main limitations of the study, and that is why STT may not have increased in a significant manner. So the breach in knowledge was partially covered, but there is still work to do in order to understand this phenomenon. And that is why future directions for research include working with an assistant in order to have more specific figures, and also working with an experimental group. That means one group receiving the treatment and another group that doesn't, in order to have more reliable results. So the last part corresponds to metacognitive analysis. And what I realized in relation to the conceptualization of the teacher-researcher's role is that the teacher's role is really complex. And I got to the conclusion that specific disciplines are only an excuse for us to be good educators. By the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're a math teacher or a history teacher or an English teacher, because what we are doing is to shape the individuals that will be part of tomorrow's society. So we need to be aware not only of the contents that we are teaching, but also about the values and the beliefs that we deliver through our lessons. So in relation specifically to seminar, I learned that we as student teachers should plan our strategies of work in order to be aware of the difficulties that might rise in the process of carrying out these tasks. And in the case of the practicum, I learned that it is important to be aware of different strategies during the development of a class. You need to know how to adapt them and how to create them in order to fix any challenge or overcome any challenge that rises during the development of the class, and that way you will have more tools to achieve your lesson objective. So through this metacognitive analysis, I could identify that my main strength is the ability to plan specific tasks, so it doesn't take me much time to plan when to carry out a certain task. Nevertheless, I also found that my major weakness is not being able to execute this plan effectively. So obviously that is detrimental because it is an obstacle to carry out the tasks. And that leads to a future challenge, that is to find ways to not only plan a schedule, but also finding ways to execute it effectively. And the way to overcome this challenge that I thought of is the use of digital resources such as maybe Google Calendar or any other mobile app that sends a notification when a task needs to be done, so I wouldn't rely only on my memory, and I will have an extra aid to carry out these tasks that need to be done. These elements are aligned with what Tomlinson states, who is an author that is reviewed in the Teaching in the Adult Context course, and he says that there are exploratory resources that facilitate the discovery about the language in use for the students. So being aware of different strategies doesn't only help you as a teacher, but it also helps your students during their learning process. We have the references.
Thank you very much, Yerko. You can now have a seat.